Hello, everyone. My name is Josh, and welcome to another edition of Discord here on Radio GBX. I'm here with James and Dane. We're going to be talking. We're talking the big talk. We're talking the big thoughts here on Radio GBX today, because we're going to be talking about the conflict in Gaza and Palestine, and how the intense controversy around that, the different ways of looking at it, the different potential solutions, the solutions that are currently being attempted right now. So I guess we're going to jump right into it. So a couple weeks ago, the UN finally passed a ceasefire resolution for the Israel-Hamas conflict. It had been blocked, 3-4 times by the U.S.?
Yeah.
Because the U.S. had wanted a different type of ceasefire. So they opposed the UN-sponsored ceasefire, but they eventually just abstained from that vote. So in your guys' views, what does that ceasefire, like the U.S. basically allowing that ceasefire resolution to pass, what does that mean? I'll go to James first.
Hi, I am James. I am one of the co-chairs of the College Democrats. I'm going to be representing your general Democratic point of view on this show. And in my opinion, the United States abstaining is kind of consistent with generally what Biden's been all about. He's kind of a centrist Democrat, and lately there has been a lot of pressure on him from members of the far left, but there's also been a lot of pressure on him because there's a fairly strong pro-Israel sentiment in the United States. So I think Biden is all about messaging, and he's trying to balance the people who would criticize him for not doing anything against the people that would criticize him for acting. So I believe by allowing it to go through without really commenting on it is how he's aiming to achieve that. And time will tell if it's successful or not.
Yeah, Dane.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can agree in part with that. The passage of the ceasefire after numerous vetoes from the United States is just evidence how unpopular the defense that the Biden campaign for Israel is trending. I mean, the Biden campaign is looking like they doomed themselves with their just devout support of Israel and of the IDF. And while I'm not a firm believer in a ceasefire as a solution to the problem by any means, it's definitely a step in the right direction that this can even happen. But yeah, I mean, kind of to echo what James has said, I mean, you're seeing millions of people across the globe taking to the streets, protesting for Palestinian liberation, and support for Israel has just become vastly, vastly unpopular with not just the far left, but even with the youth as well. We're seeing a big trend for that.
Mm-hmm. You both kind of touched on it, but why do you think the change in policy from the Biden administration? Because as we've noted, the Biden administration has been nothing but supportive of Israel since October 7th, and the U.S. position on Israel has been supportive since day one. So kind of why this shift in policy? Because after the ceasefire resolution passed in the UN, Israel canceled diplomatic trips that they're going to be having with the U.S. like the next day. So kind of what caused that? Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like we mentioned. It's just deeply, deeply unpopular position in the U.S. I mean, both parties have a wing that are against war, and you saw this even on the right with Nikki Haley being called a warmonger by members of the MAGA right, and the left is obviously against war. But I would like to note that passage of a ceasefire does not indicate any substantial change in policy, really, from the Biden administration. I mean, as it stands, we're still contributing weapons. And I just saw recently that as of April 2024, our donations to Israel are valued at almost around roughly $18 billion. And that is still going to Israel, even if there is a Security Council resolution for a ceasefire.
James, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with a lot of what he's saying, but I think there's more to it than that. Yes, support for Israel is deeply unpopular among certain circles. It is definitely deeply unpopular among younger leftists. It is less unpopular among older people, centrists, and right-leaning. Like, America has a serious problem with anti-Semitism, which is a very different thing from anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is opposition to the state of Israel or the actions. So we have a problem with anti-Semitism, but paradoxically, we have a society where coming out, or a politician voices anything less than full-throated support for the state of Israel, it's practically political suicide. But I think that is why, like, even the most radical messaging you get from politicians is calls for a ceasefire. You have no calls for a two-party solution. You have no calls for like a long-term solution for this problem. Like, all the most radical calls you get is ceasefire and send foreign aid. And I think the Biden administration has kind of found itself in a no-win situation because it is, first of all, it's an election year. And while I find a lot of Biden's actions on this problematic, but I think Trump would be so much worse. Trump has come out stating, like, if he was president, Israel would have won this by now. And I think Trump, he tried to move the American embassy to Jerusalem and tried to declare Jerusalem the capital.
Yeah, then 2018 they moved the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem and kind of like a show. I think it was more is kind of viewed as more just a show towards like the Christians who, you know, they kind of, or the Christians and the Jews who he would want to like court in a re-election campaign. But yeah, that's a different topic. But
so I think Biden is in this weird place where if he opposes it too strongly, he's going to alienate enough voters that Trump gets elected and Trump will be worse. So just because I think that we're attempting to solve this problem decades too late, and just because of that nature, there are no meaningful political actions that can be really taken at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a difficult situation, but Biden does have a way that he could maintain support, and that's to completely disavow Israel, to stop sending weapons and money there. Yeah, he might lose some support on the fringes, but the broad majority of the population is very anti-war, very scared, as they should be, of conflict and further conflict being perpetuated in the Middle East. The only solution to the problem right now, and as I would like to kind of echo what James said, we are decades too late to, kind of remedy this, but Biden does have a solution. The only reason he's not going with that solution is, like we mentioned previously, the Israel lobby and AIPAC. That's the only reason why. If he tried to remedy the situation by calling for even just a ceasefire, a little too late for that now, but completely disavowing Israel's genocide, he would regain a lot of the support, which could potentially win him the race.
Mm-hmm. And for context, for listeners, that Biden has lost delegate support in the presidential primaries because of votes for uncommitted or uninstructed or whatever, like the state version of that is. So
yeah, I mean, 50,000 people in Wisconsin voted uninstructed on April 2nd, which I was very happy to see. We had mentioned in the first show that was something that my organization, SDS, was helping to run on campus. And yeah, Biden won the state by 20,000, the amount of delegates that 20,000 votes would get him. So more than double in the state voted that. And that's not just young leftists. That's all walks of life. And yeah, it is a primary, so you can't really extrapolate who's voting for who based off of that, but it's very telling.
It is telling that there is a shift, but Biden is nothing but a career politician. Like, the man doesn't operate on maybes. He does nothing until he's absolutely certain of the result. Like, I voted uninstructed this last election, but even if he, I'm not going to be happy about it, but even if he doesn't change his change a single position between now and November, I'm still going to vote for him over Trump.
So we kind of talked about policy. So kind of, and this might be the hotter portion of this discussion. So kind of, I want to go to both of you about kind of what your ideal policy outcomes in like an ideal world where all the things that have happened could be remedied or whatever. So I'll go to James first on what his kind of what was your ideal kind of policy solution to like the Israel-Palestine conflict?
First of all, this is something that we should have taken. I don't believe in half measures. If you're going to commit to something, you commit to it fully. I think, the best time to solve this was decades ago. The best time to solve it would have been before the state of Israel was established. Second best time to solve it is now, and disavow state. I think the first step would be recognize Palestine as a country, give them territorial autonomy, give them the actual ability to govern themselves, make their own decisions, and it's kind of hard because you make a big move like that. It's almost impossible to predict like what all the ripple effects are going to be. So recognize Palestine as a country, give them autonomy, give them the right to rule themselves, figure out what comes next when it gets there.
Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of like what James mentioned. The time to adequately solve this was decades ago. Anything that the U.S. does now is just going to further perpetuate the conflict. In my opinion, and opinion of a lot of others in our organization, a two-state solution just logically does not make sense. Because if you think about it, Israel has not and will not respect another state. They routinely bomb other states. We saw that a couple of weeks ago when they bombed an embassy in Syria. We see them routinely bombing Lebanon, bombing Jordan, targeting Iraqi officials in an embassy. I don't understand what the Palestinian authorities signing an arbitrary dotted line to declare them a state does to protect the people. Israel has shown routinely throughout history, even if you want to go back to the 50s and their invasion of the Sinai Peninsula because of the nationalization of the Suez Canal, they have shown multiple times that that statehood does not matter. And on top of this, it actually came out yesterday, the U.S. vetoed recognizing Palestine as a state, which is just further evidence that the U.S. does not care about the Palestinian struggle at all.
Why? See, yeah, Israel does not recognize a lot of territorial states' rights, but how would a one-state solution possibly solve that? Because you already have Palestinians who clearly kind of already exist in an apartheid state. And you would just be taking those exact same issues and making them internal. You'd have one state, but you'd still have a second-class citizens. If you made a one-state solution, it'd be the existing Israeli system that would be likely the ones to run it because they're the ones with the current wealth and power.
Yeah, I mean, well, to tackle that, I mean, it would have to be mandated by whatever world power is facilitating this. I should have added on to my previous statement. It needs to be a secular government because there's obviously an incompatibility there, and then there needs to be proportional representation. There needs to be an adequate amount of representation for both sides, and Palestinians need to be granted the right to return. They need to be granted citizenship. All the Palestinian refugees that have came to the United States, that have came to Great Britain, to other world powers, need to be given citizenship so they can come back. And to kind of tackle what you're saying, I mean, you can make that same argument for another state. Even if they declare Palestine as a state, Gaza's already almost completely leveled. They're going to start from a negative starting point, and no country's going to want to help them because they know Israel's history. And even if they did declare Palestine a state, are they going to declare the West Bank and Gaza the same state, which are separated by a good chunk of land, we know that always works out great. I mean, you can see in in Azerbaijan with their exclave, there's a lot of conflict with that too. There would have to be a mandated secular government. And then also, they would have to completely redo the whole system. They could not have the current Israeli state apparatus in place. They would have to, and it would have to be mandated. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
I guess more fundamental. Like I think I'm more of a pragmatist than you, and I see like in an ideal world I can get on board with that, but my principal concern is like we've been close to a two-state solution a couple times before. I remember Yasser Arafat in either the late 90s or early 2000s.
Yeah, I think during the Clinton administration.
Yeah, we were so close to getting a two-state solution. It fell through because other interests pressured it, but it's almost happened on a couple occasions. But that is kind of the easier actual solution to implement, and we haven't been able to do that. So what would be your mechanism to create a one-state solution? Like, you need to convince the Israeli government to basically overthrow it and replace itself for the Palestinians, which are people that the Israeli government really does not like.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to be the challenge, and even the logic of a two-state solution doesn't make sense. I mean, you're telling people that once lived through the entirety of that land that they now have a state, which, by the way, if it was created, would be in rubble, essentially. You're stripping them of the land that they had and putting them into another land. I mean, it's similar to what we even did. I mean, most Native American tribes are considered sovereign. And we would all agree, I think, here that the current reservation system in the U.S. is deeply and horribly flawed because it operated under a similar pretext. The Israeli government is not going to like it at all. But that's exactly what the solution is going to be. They don't like it because they're currently in power, and they can currently make the Palestinians do whatever they want by using force. So I think it would have to be mandated. It would have to be a forced thing. The Israeli government's not going to like it. But if you ask most people that are residing in Israel, most of the average Jewish and Muslim and Christians, they want cohesion. They want to live together. In fact, before the state of Israel became a thing under the Ottoman Empire, they were living collectively together. It wasn't until the Zionist attitude came in that everything, kind of blew up. It's really the Netanyahu government that wouldn't want to do that. I would be confident saying that the people of Israel would want a one-state solution. They want peace, ultimately. And that's the only way forward where there's going to be peace.
Yeah, do you have anything else to add on that, James, or we can...
I don't have anything to add. Like, I agree in theory. I don't see a mechanism to make it happen in reality, though. Like, you don't... powerful, like, you see this with almost any social change. Like, to grant someone rights, to grant someone freedom, to grant someone like, you don't just give someone equality. Like, you're giving them something that has to be taken from somewhere else. And the people that have it are often very, very reluctant to give up with it. Like, you almost have to force them to give it up in some way or another. Like, change only really happens when there's a fear of the consequences for if that change doesn't happen. And I'm not seeing any mechanism where Israel would fear the consequences of not treating the Palestinians fairly. And you add on to that, like, there's been so much prejudice and oppression that even if we had the perfect solution in front of us now, there's literally no possible way to actually, like, make up for a lot of the oppression that has occurred to the Palestinian people. Like, there's no possible way to square the equation.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of highlight some of that, I definitely with the later part of your statement, I mean, yeah, there's no way that you're going to replace 30,000 lives. There's nothing that you can do. No amount of money is going to replace the innocent people that have died. But on what you were saying about social change is almost always fought for. And you see all the groups that are protesting, whether it be in the United States or abroad, or even the groups in the Middle East that are protesting, are all calling for one state solutions. And yeah, there is definitely a reluctancy from the oppressive group in any scenario to give up power, and that is why sometimes violence is a necessary form of social change. And this is what we are seeing manifested actually through the entirety of the Middle East. Social change, sometimes we would all love a democratic and peaceful way for it to happen. Sometimes violence is the only answer. And on top of that, the U.S. would not care about overthrowing governments. They've done that all throughout the 20th century. They've written multiple books about all of the coups that were facilitated, even in the not even in the Middle East, in South America and in Europe as well. It's something that could be done, and the U.S.'s lack of action is very telling.
Do you think, because you mentioned like maybe sometimes like violence is the only kind of solution, do you think like that would end up just kind of prolonging the situation? Like if you have like a one state solution that either like favors the Palestinians or vice versa, do you think like what James was saying earlier, that would just kind of internalize kind of these, so instead of like you have the two countries of Israel and Palestine, you'd have like you just combine them and then just have that being internal into one country? Do you think that would happen at all?
Yeah, I mean, there would obviously be, growing pains, but I think that if the people were corralled and were united, because like I mentioned, Netanyahu's position is deeply unpopular with the people of Israel. They're protesting as we speak about the action that he's taken. And if they could recognize, and the Palestinian people could recognize and view themselves collectively as a working class, as the same people, merely just divided a lot by ethnicity, I think that the government might not like it, and the government want to go back to the old system, but the people that would be in that one state, that would be living together, that would be more peaceful, there would be a lot less people dying. I think that those people, the working class in said utopian state, would come together and realize that this is the solution, and there might be some disputes from the people and from the government. And I do think that, yeah, there definitely would be some growing pains. I mean, you still see that in South Africa, and that's another thing too when you're talking about two states is. South Africa is a prime example. They went through a very similar apartheid system in South Africa, and they're a single state now. Obviously, it has its flaws, and the consequences of apartheid are still running very rampant there, but it is a possible solution.
It is a possible solution, but the problem, inequality tends to perpetuate itself. Like, yeah, South Africa is still got some serious inequalities after it ended apartheid. We have some serious issues. America has some very major problems with systemic inequality and racism, and slavery has been over for over 100 years, and the Civil Rights Act in 1965. We still have those issues. If you'd create a two-state solution rather than a two-state solution, Palestinians just by default, even if they get their proportional representation, even if they're treated with relative equality by Israeli citizens, they're still going to be second-class citizens because of the wealth disparity. And if you give a two-state solution instead, Palestine would be a poorer nation than Israel. Israel has taken the best lands. Israel has the best water resources, best access to shipping. It would be a poorer nation, but it would be a nation of equals. And I think a nation of equals gives a better chance for its people to flourish.
I mean, yeah, there definitely is something to that. If they were integrated, yeah, they would be starting from a lower point in the socioeconomic ladder than their Israeli counterparts. But that's why there needs to be some sort of policy in place to kind of correct that. And I'm not proposing that you just call it a one-state solution and call it a day. There needs to be some sort of reparative action at the very least that needs to be taken. I mean, and this is something it's a controversial topic in the United States, and we're 200 years or so, little less, removed from slavery. There would be a lot of support for a reparative action. That's why I mentioned the right to return, even just some sort of land reallocation or something like that. Yeah, it would probably be deeply unpopular. But if you want to fix the problem, that policy would need to be put in place too. And on top of that, you did kind of address it when you were talking, James, but isolating all the Palestinian people and having them live in poverty in another country, which, by the way, is going to be bordering the country that will still likely be bombing them and still likely be controlling them, isn't really any more of a solution. I mean, you're still just setting all these people up for failure by giving them their own territory in which they can all live in poverty together and still be under threat from Israel. To me, that just does not seem like a logical solution to the problem.
It may or may not be, but I think the bigger question is either of those solutions, like these solutions are both well and good on paper, and we can debate them academically all day, but neither of them have the slightest chance while there's literally still a genocide going on. And yes, the U.S. did not veto the resolution demanding a ceasefire, but UN resolutions are kind of worthless, and we have nothing. There has been no action taken to actually demand a ceasefire in any form that Israel would be listening to. Now, Biden has agreed to step up humanitarian aid, which is a good thing. It is not enough. But there have been no actions to end the actual bloodshed that is happening right now. And you need to crack that nut before you can crack the nut of how do we restore these people to a place of equality. And so far, we just don't have that.
I'll get to you in a second, but I just want to because that kind of goes into something else I want to talk about, but with in regards to the aid workers specifically, but with Dane, what were you going to say? Yeah,
I mean, I was going to say I completely agree with that, James, and yeah, aid is one thing. Aid is obviously a good thing to have to these people, but this just fully cements my position on President Biden. There could be a more adequate solution. What we're doing is we're giving bullets to somebody who's saying that they're not going to commit a crime with, and then once they commit a crime, we keep giving them bullets, and then we're wondering why the crime keeps taking place. And so that is why, in my view, I can't President Biden. That's why he's doing so bad amongst a lot of the pro-Palestine crowd.
Yeah, you can. Do you have anything else you want to say about that, or that?
Yeah, he's doing bad against among a bunch of leftists and younger pro-Palestinian people, but it's easy to forget and ignore perspectives of people you don't regularly interact with. And there is a large percentage of American, usually evangelical Christians, that believe that when Israel comes under legitimate threat, it is going to, it's going to herald the apocalypse and the second return of Jesus. And some of them are accelerationists that want that to happen right now, but most of them don't want that to happen. They want the world, they view Israel's existence as an important to the existence of the planet. And the moment you take any step to oppose that, they are going to show up and oppose you in force, because there's nothing stronger than a religious conviction that this is the right thing to do, because there's no way to argue against that. It's simply what they believe.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely some truth there, but I would just like to reiterate that it's not really just a radical left movement. I mean, 50,000 people. That's not the radical left movement. There was people from all walks, all political viewpoints, and I speak from experience. I know people personally that are independents, that are middle of the road moderates, that voted uninstructed because they don't like war, and that's something that is popular for pretty much everybody. And that was something we had listed in the outline, was domestic politics, because when you have a lobby as strong as the Israeli lobby, all that money, that 18 billion that I was mentioning earlier, that's money that could be spent in the U.S. As U.S. citizens, we pay for the Israeli citizens to have free health care, but yet we don't have free health care. So that's where the disconnect is people don't want money going to foreign countries when there are domestic problems that really need to be solved.
It depends on the problem, because there's a lot of popular support for Ukraine, for example. There's a lot of popular support against Russia. But I mean, that is, objectively speaking, Ukraine is, the David against the evil Goliath, to use a metaphor. I think that's why that's more popular. But I see this as more of a systemic issue. Like, I think just the current state of American politics makes it, like, I criticize the genocide in the strongest possible terms. I feel like the current state of American politics and American political discourse makes meaningful action currently impossible. And like what Dane was talking about, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Vote Non-Committed, those movements, I think those movements are starting points to begin changing the discourse and opinion. But you're, like, optimistic, even if you go grassroots full send, like, you're looking a few election cycles before that, perpetuates through society to the point where it has even the remotest possibility of actually accomplishing something. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that is the start of a long-term solution when we've got a short-term crisis on our hands right now.
Mm-hmm. And we saw Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer basically calling for new elections in Israel to get rid of Netanyahu, and Schumer himself is Jewish. And then Biden, after the aid workers were killed in an apparent, a seeming accident by Israel, depending on your viewpoint, or supposed accident, I should say, that Biden was also expressing outrage for the people of, like, for the casualties, especially because one American was killed in that attack. So is that kind of an example of more like affecting domestic policy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously what happened was a horrible tragedy, and Israel is obviously going to play defense and to say that, there was miscalculation or something like that. But you hear consistently, in fact, I heard on the news days after that just how precise Israel's drones are. You heard that with their attack of the Iranian embassy. So there's a disconnect there, because at the same time that Israel's drones are so accurate and so state-of-the-art, they accidentally strike aid workers and kill 7 people. And quite frankly, the only reason why the Western world cares about that is because those people are white. Full stop. That's the only reason why. They didn't care when 35,000 people have been, for lack of a better term, genocided by the Israeli government. But all of a sudden, when 7 Western white people die, that's when there's a meaningful policy difference. That's when there's a nuanced discussion to be had. And that was just another thing that was more disappointing, because to me it was blatantly obvious that was what caused that. Because, yeah, I mean, why do nothing about 35,000 people, but then when a white citizen dies, then it's time to change.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but I guess I understand it. Like, it's more like any event is more meaningful when it hits close to home. Like knowing in an academic sense. Well, and I forget who said it. There's a quote that it's like if 100 people die, that's a tragedy. If 1,000,000 people die, that's a statistic. It hits close to home when it's, somebody that's, lived within driving distance of you. And the news also broke that like they were broadcasting their GPS coordinates to Israel at the time, declaring that they were aid workers, and Israel hit them anyway, which just I think that's part of it, just showing the absolute callousness on the part of Israel. So I don't think it's all racism, but that probably has something to do with it. And I do condemn the initial actions of Hamas that kind of started this whole thing in the strongest possible terms. Like, I don't need to like Hamas to love the people of Palestine. And there's some articles and some accusations, because right before this whole event kicked off, Benjamin Netanyahu was facing calls for resignation over a judicial reform he was pushing that would have basically eliminated the power of Israel's Supreme Court to overturn government decisions. And you kind of saw it after 9/11, where Bush is like one of the most unpopular presidents we've ever had. But right after 9/11, everyone loved him. If you voiced anything less than full-throated support of Bush, you were seen as kind of a traitor.
Yeah, Bush had a 90% approval rating in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, like nothing unites people like a common enemy. And it's also conveniently come out that one of the biggest providers of funding for the military branch of Hamas was Netanyahu himself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's that's well documented. Exactly what you said is right there, James. I mean, the whole reason why Hamas is even in power is because there was a forced election in 2006 by the Bush administration. The Palestinian people said that they were not ready to have an election. And Bush goes in and does what he does best and is saying, too bad, you guys are having an election. And that is what led to the rise of Hamas being the political party. And yeah, I mean, there is just a large movement of people that in Israel that don't like Netanyahu, and it's not just his judicial reform. He appointed Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a known Islamophobe, has praised a mosque shooter multiple times in Israel, and Netanyahu appointed him as the security minister, like right before this all happened. So yeah, they're definitely, as much as I'm not a fan of regime change in countries, I think that it can be obviously a good thing when there's a regime like the Netanyahu regime that's in place right now.
And Netanyahu is an interesting figure because he's been prime minister of Israel, 3 separate times?
Yeah.
Because he had been elected in, I think, the late 90s, and then he was voted out or whatever, and then he got back in, and then he was prime minister until, 2021? And then he got voted out again, and then now he's back in office. So it's interesting that you have a figure like Netanyahu who's been around for literally decades and just in and out of power.
Yeah, it does not want to give it up.
Yeah. I had a thought, but I've heard it, like, in terms of media, and I think even in, like, classes or from professors, that Israel is basically the U.S.'s only ally in the Middle East, or, like, strong ally compared to some other nations, especially after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. Do you think that is also just kind of a significant factor in, like, the U.S.-Israel relations and how Israel will, or how the U.S. will treat Israel in this conflict, even if there's, like, significant disagreements, like with Biden just outright criticizing Israel over, like, the aid workers or allowing the ceasefire to pass? Is that anything?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that's a factor that, we always hear that Israel is like the so-called beacon of democracy in the Middle East or whatever. It's really tricky when you have a region that has had so much unrest which has been in large part because of Western countries. I mean, like I mentioned previously, Iran. The reason Iran is in the state that it's in is because the U.S. and the British facilitated a coup in the 50s. So a lot of that is U.S. cause, but then we act like we're also the solution to the problem. And with Israel being an ally, the U.S. doesn't need allies. We have 800 or more military bases across the world. We don't need more allies than we have. And Saudi Arabia is also an ally of the U.S. And that was one thing I know early on before this recent flare-up on October 7th, there was talk of Iran and Saudi Arabia actually kind of bridging the divide a little bit and making significant talks towards peace because, there's also been a proxy war happening in Yemen between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so, yeah, I think that definitely Israel being an ally of the U.S. Is a huge factor. But quite frankly, I don't think the U.S. should be involved at all over there. I think the U.S. should be a social worker, not a police officer. I don't think we need a glorified aircraft carrier, so to speak, in Israel in the Middle East.
Well, we don't need it, but like if you like subscribe to the realism theory of international relations, realism basically states that every nation acts only according to its own interests and based on power generally. It's contrasted to the liberal theory of international relations states that nations want to cooperate, and the radical theory is basically based on economies and finances. But the realism states that the only thing that is important for a country is the ability to advocate for itself and its own interests. And that is, the theory that most of your defense people are going to subscribe to. It's a very common one. And according to that theory, we don't ever want to give any of that up. And since the age of mutually assured destruction, when every major world power has enough nukes to wipe out the entire planet, no major countries really go directly to war anymore. We engage in proxy conflicts, like ourselves and Russia are engaging in a proxy conflict in Ukraine right now. Ourselves and Iran are kind of engaging in a proxy conflict with Israel, and Israel is the only real state in the region that is willing to act as our proxy in exchange and do the dirty work that we don't want to put our names on in exchange for support. And I don't agree with that, but that is the reason that you're never going to convince anyone, you're never going to convince politicians to stop supporting Israel unless you give them a better alternative. People do not willingly give up on power.
Yeah, and I can definitely agree with some of that there, and especially, the international relations theories. And I mean, it's an opinion of mine as someone who is actually in multiple international relations or international relations-based classes here on campus is, yeah, I mean, realism is the reason why we don't have significant progress towards any global issue. It's a prime example why climate change isn't being tackled the way that it should be, because states think that other states are preying on their downfall, and we can't come together collectively to realize that this is an all of us problem, and it's not necessarily an America problem. And yeah, unless we get rid of money in politics and we get rid of the lobbying and the super PACs and things like AIPAC, yeah, realistically, it's going to be very difficult because you need money to get into power in this country. Quite a bit of it, actually, depending on what race you're running for. And yeah, there's not going to be, as long as there's super PACs and large political contributions coming from defense companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, there's never going to not be a conflict because it's profitable.
Yeah, given that and our current political system, I agree on paper with your idealism, but I just don't believe it's possible. I believe that there is precisely, given the climate, given that it's an election year, I think there's exactly one path forward that doesn't run and it still might not work. There's one path forward that doesn't run a really high risk of just making the situation worse. And that is, I don't think Biden, for political reasons, is ever going to disavow Israel. But what he can do is forcefully advocate for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid, which is not, to be clear, that is not a long-term solution. You've got a ton of problems that still absolutely need to get solved. But that puts a pause on the senseless violence, and it allows a foot in the door for like a more lasting peacemaking process, which it's going to be something that's going to involve lots and lots of discussions, negotiations, and it's not going to be easy, but there's a possibility of it.
We have about 3 minutes left for the show. For just kind of wrap up, because we've kind of danced around it with the kind of U.S. domestic policy implications of this conflict. So you've seen with the Ukraine war that support for Ukraine was pretty high to start, but then it kind of waned over time in terms of the U.S. popular support. Do you think, because obviously right now it plays a very intense role in our presidential election, do you think as time goes on there will be a similar, either will support for Israel increase or decrease, or support for Palestine increase or decrease, or just support for the war in general kind of shift as we go into November?
I'll keep this super short. I think that support for Ukraine changed because it became a topic that got politicized. Whether support or opposition to the war in Israel changes depends on how politicized the topic gets.
Yeah, I mean, I think I largely agree with that. I think that as we get closer to the election, support is going to wane. I mean, we do see in elections, usually economy and I believe immigration are like the number one and number two issues for people. We actually just learned about this in class the other day, James and I. Foreign policy isn't really big on a lot of people's radar. All they know is they're not getting paid what they should be, or their taxes are too high. So that's where people can kind of engage with foreign policy. So yeah, I do think as other things come up, like as the supposed border crisis blows up even more than it already has, then yeah, we will see support start to decline.
And then, kind of going off of that, do you think this is it a good opportunity, I guess, to put it in a way for people to get involved with foreign policy, like both the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and then also the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? Because yeah, like you said, it's something that people don't necessarily pay attention to unless it's a big deal, like maybe the war on terror in the 2000s. Do you think that it's a good opportunity for people to get involved in foreign policy debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is great to get people more active. I would just let everybody know that's listening is you got to be careful, obviously, if you want to engage in any sort of discussion. The news that you see on popular TV platforms is going to manufacture consent for the Israeli point of view. So I would just encourage anybody that's listening to widen, look at multiple sources if you really want to have a discussion, because just watching any spectrum of the news on TV is not going to give you an adequate understanding of what's going on. And that's part of the issue with foreign policy too.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an opportunity, but I think it's going to be really difficult to get a lot of people involved because, well, humans are self-interested creatures. There are a lot of people that act really selflessly, but we're self-interested creatures. The first problem you're going to run into is convincing people to care. Why do you care about people you've never interacted with that live half a world away? Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it's a problem you're going to run into. And then how do you get people to care enough to actually take action? And I think that's going to be a big hurdle that any opposition to Israel and our stance on Israel is going to run into.
Mm-hmm. A lot to think about, a lot of food for thought. Definitely probably one of the more controversial topics we're going to talk about on this show, but I appreciate both of you being willing to come on and discuss your opposing viewpoints and all that.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, for sure. This is, obviously something that needs to be talked about. So,
mm-hmm. And definitely something that's going to be, we're going to hear about for the foreseeable future. So definitely good to learn where all the views are. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank James and Dane for coming on. Make sure to keep listening to Radio GBX and keep a lookout for our next show. So, all right, have a good weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.